Hello, and welcome to Part 2 of the Pre-Columbian Contact Iceberg Explained. In this series, we take a look at some of the most intriguing claims of contact between the Old World and New World that allegedly took place before Columbus, sometimes hundreds of years before Columbus. Are the powers that be trying to hide the truth? Are the history professors telling us a lie? You decide. Tonight, we start with the Book of Mormon claims. As many of you know, the Book of Mormon is a religious text for the Latter-day Saint movement. It's supposed to contain the writings of ancient prophets who lived on the American continent sometime between 600 BC and 421 AD. The works, which were published by Joseph Smith in 1830, is typically regarded primarily as scripture, and secondarily as a record of God's dealing with the ancient inhabitants of the Americas. The majority of followers view it as a legit record of real-world history, and is similarly viewed as a key part of their religion. But we are not going to take a look at this from a religious or spiritual standpoint. We are just going to look at the historical claims and the validity of them. And in the interest of saving time, I'm not going to do a background on Smith and his writings. You can look that up if you're interested. But basically, he was visited by an angel who directed him to a buried book of golden plates that told a Judeo-Christian story of an ancient American civilization. It begins in ancient Jerusalem around 600 BC and tells the story of a man named Lehi and his family and several others that are led by God from out of the city shortly before it falls to the Babylonians. They then journey across the Arabian Peninsula and take a ship to a promised land, which is some unknown location in the Americas. It's also worth noting here that the scripture also tells of a much earlier people who had fled to this land before the Tower of Babel fell. These people had set up a society too, but because of their rivalries and factions, the whole thing collapsed, and these people were gone before this expedition arrived. But a record left from them prophesies that a new Jerusalem would be built in the Americas. But Lehi's expedition would land in the Promised Land in 590 BC, and they would give a description of the various beasts in the forest, as well as speaking of the gold, silver, and copper that was found. Then the story documents the group's dealings from then to about 130 BC, during which time the community grows and splits into two main groups, called Nephites and Lamanites, that frequently war with each other throughout the rest of the narrative. After the passing of time, only one of these would remain, and that is the Lamanites. And according to this, they are among the ancestors of the Native Americans. In 1842, the church newspaper, under the editorship of Joseph Smith, claimed to have identified the ruins of an ancient native civilization in Mexico and Central America that proved the Book of Mormon's historical authenticity. However, the church officially does not give the location in regards to where all this stuff took place, claiming that speculation may mislead instead of enlighten, and that can be a distraction from its divine purpose. In the past couple of decades, there's been a big push towards the Heartland model, which postulates that the events took place in the heartland of North America, which extends from the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Plains and from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. They point to the Hopewell culture ruins and others as proof. The account is largely discredited by most scholars, as none of the Book of Mormon really correlates with the archaeological and historical evidence that has been found, as well as there is no evidence that shows the Mormons were an influence on any Mesoamerican society. One key example is that of the horse, which is said to have been discovered in the forest when the expedition arrived. Yet, horses were not on the American continent at that time, and there's a dozen or more examples like this that just don't add up. But defenders of the faith claim that the word horse could have been used to describe a different type of animal. Regardless, this one really comes down to faith, so we'll just move on. Vinland Map. The Vinland Map was a map that first came into light in 1957 and would be secretly sold to Yale University in 1958 for the price of $300,000, or roughly $3 million in today's money. The map purportedly claimed to be a 15th century map that showed unique information about the Norse exploration of America. Yale would put in years of research on it, culminating in a book in 1965, which made the map very popular, because in addition to showing Africa, Asia, and Europe, it depicted a land southwest of Greenland in the Atlantic named Vinland, which we discussed in Part 1. The map describes this region as being visited by Europeans in the 11th century, which of course made this map a very important piece of history and very valuable. And if I was making this video a few years ago, this segment would be much longer. But in 2018, over half a century after it was brought to light, the debate over the legitimacy of this map would finally be ended, and it was proven to be a forgery. And with that, we'll move on. Cranial morphology of the Botocudo Indians. In 1876, Brazilian anthropologist João Batista de Lacerda and another man, whom I could only find the last name Peixoto, published findings of an investigation into a new human skull collection in Rio de Janeiro's Natural History Museum. The two men would bring up an interesting theory, and that was that due to the cranial morphology of the Botocudo Indians, it was just possible that these natives were of Polynesian origin, most likely coming from the island of Rapa Nui. The people known as Botocudo in eastern Brazil are mostly known for the wooden disc that they wear in their lips and ears, and they were also a hunter-gatherer type society, and in an era where colonists were not known to be especially nice to the indigenous peoples. The Portuguese were insanely brutal to the Botocudo, and that may be because of the rich diamond fields they discovered there around the 18th century. The Portuguese tried their hardest to completely wipe them out. They intentionally tried to spread smallpox, as well as leaving poisoned food scattered in the forest, and at least one Portuguese commander boasted of killing hundreds. But as depressing as that story is, the Botocudo did survive, and there are still a few hundred left today. But in getting back to this mystery, in a recent genomic study on the skulls, at least 2 of the 35 Botocudo individuals at the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro were shown to have mitochondrial DNA lineages currently found in Polynesians, and again, no one knows why. What is known is that the Botocudos stand out compared to the rest of the South American natives, and we now know there is a genetic connection with the Polynesians. This one basically kinda just adds more validity to the theory that there was some kind of intermingling between the Polynesians and indigenous peoples of South America. And as a final side note, a huge fire at the National Museum in 2018 destroyed about 90% of everything there. This included every bit of the Botocudo skulls. Gender in Amazonia and Melanesia. The title, Gender in Amazonia and Melanesia, belongs to a book written by Thomas Gregor that looks at an interesting cultural mystery, that of the peoples of the Amazon and the peoples of Melanesia, 2 places that are separated by half a world in distance, yet have a lot of similarities when it comes to gender and sex, as well as the way their social hierarchies are, and how the men have an almost hostile approach to women, and even somewhat kind of having a fear of women. But it also touches on other things too, like puberty, and because of that, I'm not going to touch any more on this subject, other than to say the goal of the author was to once again show a link between Polynesian and South American cultures. João Vaz Corte-Real expeditions. If you watched the first video in this series, then the name Gaspar Corte-Real should probably ring a bell. He's the lost Portuguese explorer who, along with his brother Miguel, were speculated to have built the mysterious Newport Tower in Rhode Island, in which they hoped would catch the attention of a passing ship and rescue them. And while the Corte-Real brothers were pretty famous explorers in their own right, partially due to their disappearance after exploring Newfoundland in 1501, people often forget that their father João was exploring some 30 years earlier in the 1470s, and it's here that our mystery begins, because according to somewhat questionable evidence, a joint expedition between the King of Portugal, Alfonso V, and the King of Denmark, Christian I, was planned around 1472, as João, along with his sons Miguel and Gaspar, were appointed by the Portuguese king to accompany the German sailors Dietrich Pining and Hans Pothorst, as well as a Polish sailor named John Scovis, who may or may not have existed, and if he did, sources vary on if he was Polish, Norwegian, or Welsh. There's even theories that the name John Scovis was just an alias for someone who wanted to remain anonymous, perhaps even Columbus himself. Regardless, the expedition started in Norway and sailed past Greenland via Iceland, where they would discover land in 1473, although some sources say this took place later in 1476. They called this land Terra Nova do Bacalhau, which translates to New Land of the Codfish, which would most likely be Newfoundland and the cod-infested Grand Banks. By 1508, the island would start to pop up on Portuguese maps. Strangely, this journey isn't documented until a century later, around 1580, in Gaspar Frutuoso's book called Saudades de Terra. In this series of books, it's alleged that after João discovered Newfoundland, King Alfonso gave him command on the Azores island of Terceira, which was one of the 3 capital cities of the Azores and the most important one historically. So it was a very prestigious gift, and supporters of this theory claim that João was given it because of his discovery of the new land of codfish. And it should be noted here too, that Dietrich Peining, the German who went with him, was appointed governor of Iceland as well for his reward. Adding further proof that this may have happened is that of John Cabot, who landed in Newfoundland in 1497. When he began to place names on the geographical features of the area, he of course used English names, except for one barren island off the coast of Newfoundland. He called it Bacalhau Island, which is derived from the Portuguese word for, you guessed it, codfish, suggesting that he was aware of the previous discovery, and meaning that everyone knew about North America for at least 30 years before Columbus disembarked. And speaking of Columbus, this might be the reason why the Portuguese King John II famously turned down Columbus in 1484 when he first approached the Portuguese for help financing his expedition, and it may also be why the Portuguese accused the Spanish of encroaching on their territory after Columbus landed in the New World. However, skeptics point out that nowhere in the records does it say João was gifted his governorship because of the discovery. It only reads that the command was given to him for the, quote, expenses he had incurred, end quote, and, quote, services rendered, end quote. Furthermore is the fact is that all this was recorded a century after, and the book it was recorded in, the aforementioned Saudades de Terra, is full of misinformation. Some say it's blatant Portuguese propaganda, and not to mention, there's barely any records of the German sailors who went along. It's because of this, the claim is considered suspicious by most scholars. Narragansett Runestone. In December of 1984, an unnamed person was digging around in the mudflats of Narragansett Bay in search of clams when they came across a peculiar stone. This sandstone, which was roughly 60 feet offshore and was only visible during the extreme low tide, is about 7 feet long, 5 feet high, and 2.5 feet wide, inscribed with 2 rows of symbols, which some indicate resemble ancient runic characters. The Rhode Island Historical Preservation and Heritage Commission would start to pore over the archives, and they found that the Narragansett Runestone, aka the Quidnessent Rock, was first mentioned in a geologist's report in 1939. However, the report mentions nothing about inscriptions. The stone was also said to have been further upland. They assumed the stone over time had been buried by the elements. The weirdest part of this story is the stone's disappearance. Sometime between July and August 2012, the stone simply vanished. But by May of 2013, it was discovered that a local resident, who was tired of tourists showing up, scouring the neighborhood and shoreline looking for the stone. So this unnamed man removed the stone, went further off coast, and just dropped it in. When state officials learned of this, they made him go back out and get it. After this, the University of Rhode Island took the stone in for testing, but they would cancel these plans, citing that it would destroy the stone. After this, he was placed in Wickford, Rhode Island for public viewing. As far as theories go, many people have pointed to the hooked X carved into the stone, which is believed to be a symbol used by the Knights Templar. This was further elaborated on by forensic geologist Scott Water on the TV show American Unearthed. He believed it was carved in the 1300s by the Knights Templar as part of a map in the region, which also ties to the Newport Tower. Others have cited that the inscriptions are a type of informal Latin, which reads, quote, registry boundary line, the owner, end quote. And of course, the ever-popular Viking theories, which states that the runic symbols are Icelandic, and that it reads, Screaming River, or Fort Victorious near the river. Others believe that while it is indeed Icelandic, it was created in the 18th or 19th century by Icelandic immigrants as a homage to their ancestors. Some even think that the Vikings left it as a warning about the bears in the area. There's just no real agreement on what it says. Yet, the skeptical point of view is that it was probably created in the late 1800s and was made by someone trying to imitate Viking runes. Actually, in 2014, a man named Everett Brown, after hearing of the stone's theft and recovery, would come out and state that him and his brother had made the carvings way back in 1964 when he was 13. They did it by using a chisel from their father's toolset. He claimed he was trying to carve the word Skrælings, which was the term the Vikings called the Indians, using runic alphabet he saw at the library. However, close to a dozen older residents in the area state that they remembered seeing the carvings as far back as the 1940s. One of these, Pat Lindsay, whose parents owned the land the stone was on, said everyone called it Indian stone because they thought the Indians had made it. By now, most people believe that Everett Brown is lying, and he did not make the inscriptions when he was a teenager. However, it should be pointed out that the family that owned this property from 1840 to the late 1930s never once mentioned a stone with inscriptions. Furthermore, is the mystery of why no one ever discovered the inscriptions until 1984. Is this because it was made recently, as a hoax? Or could it be that the inscriptions were just buried under the sand? Without testing, it's really impossible to say who could have created these inscriptions, or what exactly they say. Alonso Sánchez. Have you ever heard of Alonso Sánchez? The man who accidentally discovered the Americas, only for it to be covered up by Spain? Yeah, me neither. But that's what this next conspiracy alleges. The story gets its start in 1609, in a book called Actual Comments of the Incas, which is written by Inca Garcilaso de la Vega. The book is considered a classic, and his historical accounts are regarded as very reputable and legit. He was mestizo, and had recorded accounts from both his mother's Incan side of the family, as well as his Spanish father's side of the family. And in regards to the story about Alonso Sánchez, he said his sources for that came from some old conquistadors that he knew as a youth, and it's in these writings that he states a man named Alonso Sánchez used to sail quite often between the Canary Islands, Southampton, England, and Seville, in which he was involved in some sort of trade between the three locations, and sometime between 1480 and 1485, most commonly cited as 1484. While he was en route to the Canary Islands, a fierce storm blew his ship drastically off course and into the unknown mid-Atlantic Ocean. The small ship was luckily only slightly damaged, but it encountered more unfavorable winds and currents, which dragged it further southwest. After about 28 or 29 more days of sailing, Sánchez and his terrified crew sighted land, most likely that of Santo Domingo, or formerly known as Hispaniola, and they landed long enough to determine their position, document what happened and what they had seen. Then they restocked their fresh water and wood and made the long journey back home. But during the trip, they ran out of water and food, and the crew became very sick. So much so that only 5 of the original 17 men on board survived, one of these being Sánchez. They finally landed at Porto Santo, and just by coincidence, Sánchez would meet Columbus, as Columbus lived there in the 1480s, and he, along with the other 4 survivors, would tell Columbus of their adventure, and then they all died of exhaustion at Columbus's home. It was then that Columbus would inherit the ship's logs and charts, and would use them a decade later. That kinda sounds more like a fictional movie script than reality. So maybe that's why years later, chroniclers would add to the story a bit more, just to spice it up. It was now claimed that Sánchez sailed down the coast of this land until they encountered signs of human habitation. They would then land and were treated warmly. The natives were impressed by the much taller and bearded Spaniards. The natives would tell them that they were told their gods would eventually come to visit them from the sea, and they believed these Spaniards to be of those gods. They gave them food and gold and even their women. The men then sailed back to Porto Santo, where they all met Columbus and relayed the message before they all perished. And then Columbus sat on the secret for almost 10 years, and that leads to the question of why. Why did the Spanish cover this up for almost a decade? According to the conspiracy, mostly made famous by the Duchess of Medina Sidonia, Luisa Isabel Alvarez de Toledo, who passed away in 2008, claimed that when Alonso Sánchez discovered the New World, the geopolitical situation for the Catholic monarchy of Spain was not in a good position at the time, and that announcing these newly found lands would have brought on some strong opposition, especially from Portugal, France, and Rome. And since Spain did not have the resources to defend their claim, they waited until 1492, when Alexander VI from Aragon, which is now Spain, was elected Pope, ensuring they would side with Spain. It was only then that they sent Columbus on his first official voyage to the west, knowing good and well he was going to find these territories and lay claim to them in the name of the Catholic monarchs. She further stated that Alonso Sánchez should be known as the true discoverer. However, historians widely discredit this theory and state that the Alonso Sánchez story was nothing more than a false rumor spread by the Pinzón brothers to discredit Columbus in his later years. The brothers had actually traveled with Columbus on his original voyages, but had a falling out with him, and if it wasn't the Pinzón brothers, it could have been any one of the many political enemies Columbus had made. Indeed, even as early as the 1520s, many rumors had already begun to spread that the New World was really discovered by an unnamed man. It wouldn't be until 1609 that the name Alonso Sánchez was finally attached to the legend. For what it's worth, historians have pored over numerous records from that era and have never been able to find a man with that name, but maybe they are lying to us. Alonso Pinzón sailed to Brazil before guiding Columbus / Jean Cousin. And right after discussing the Pinzón brothers, we roll into this next conspiracy. When it comes to explorers, there may be no one in history more underrated than the Pinzón brothers, because most historians cite that without them, there was zero chance Columbus would have succeeded. It's why they're sometimes credited as being the co-discoverers of America, and for good reason. For one, Alonso was a wealthy and famous shipbuilder, and before he gave his support to the expedition, Columbus was having a tough time finding anyone to enlist. But once Alonso signed on, he, along with all the distinguished contacts that he had, put together a very skilled crew. But it wasn't just the money and fame. Alonso was a gifted mariner and a leader. Multiple times on the journey, he, along with his brother, got them out of difficult situations. And when Columbus started to lose the crew's respect, after a tiring voyage that seemed to be going nowhere, Alonso was the one able to resolve the situation. And even during the most difficult and discouraging parts of the journey, Alonso was remarkably confident that they were going to find land. Almost too confident. And that's kind of where this conspiracy comes into play. It's alleged that in 1488, 4 years before the Columbus expedition, Martin Alonso had already been to Brazil, thereby becoming the real discoverer of the Americas, and also explaining why he was so confident about the journey. So what is the story behind this one? According to Desmarques's History of Dieppe, the captain of a merchant ship from Normandy, France, named Jean Cousin, was sailing off the coast of Africa when their vessel was forced by storms far to the southwest, where they landed at an unknown land and discovered the mouth of a mighty river, which would be the Amazon. And just by chance, on this fleet of merchant ships, the first mate / captain of one of the other ships was Alonso Pinzón. Apparently, they did not hang around to see what land they had stumbled into. Instead, they turned around and went back home. It's said that on the return voyage, something went amiss, and Pinzón's conduct became viewed as mutinous. When they landed, Jean made a complaint to the Admiralty and charged Pinzón with mutiny, insubordination, and violence. Alonso would be banished from the city. It was this move that allegedly led to him leaving, and depending on which source you believe, Alonso either heard about the planned Columbus expedition and went to join, since he already knew that land was there, or he took the secret information to Columbus and started to plan the trip together, and then basically just guided Columbus to the New World. And although the French have long used this claim to say that they discovered the Americas, the account of the discovery would go on to say, quote, "They had neither the wit nor the forethought to leave a public accounting of their travels to assure the status of their discoveries," end quote. Regardless, there's no indisputable written records that support this claim. The only thing close was a claim by French navigator Bernat Palmier de Gonville, who stated that when he visited Brazil in 1504, the locals had told him that the French had been trading there for several years, but it should be noted that King Charles IX used these claims to justify the French attempts at colonizing Florida and Fort Caroline, citing that the French discovered the New World before Spain. Hence, the claim was probably nothing more than a way to skirt around the land claims. Heavener Runestone. As far as surprising locations for a runestone to be discovered, Oklahoma has to be near the top of the list, just because of its location alone, way out in south-central US. One would not typically think the Vikings could have ever made it that far, but that's what this next mystery alleges, because there's actually been a few stones recovered there. But the oldest and most famous one is the one we are going to talk about. That is the Heavener Runestone, which was discovered in 1923, according to the official record at least, because some accounts state that it was actually discovered a century earlier in the 1830s by a Choctaw hunting party. However, the official record states that it was found near Heavener, Oklahoma, and the characters on the stone belong to the Elder Futhark alphabet, which is the oldest form of runic alphabets, around 2,000 years old, and was a writing system used by the Germanic people. The sandstone slab itself is pretty impressive in size, standing at 10 feet by 12 feet high. For nearly a century before it started to attract attention from scholars, the locals just called it Indian rock because they thought the inscriptions had been created by the Choctaw tribe. The inscription reads either Nome Valley or it's someone's personal name, G. Nomadal. Archaeologist Ken Feder has claimed that unlike the runestones found on the east coast of Canada, there's absolutely no archaeological evidence that suggests the Vikings made it to Oklahoma, or even anywhere near the Midwest. And that is the most common view of most archaeologists, as they say it was most likely created by an early Scandinavian immigrant in the 1800s. Some stories specifically say that it was a Swedish man working at a local train depot that was responsible. However, some scholars have left the door open to it being something much older. Henrik Williams, a professor of Nordic languages, said of the stone that it was most likely made in the 19th century, but there was about a 20% chance that it was actually dated back to the 10th or 11th century, and that's been a theory held on to since the 50s, as supporters of this theory claim that an unknown Viking expedition made it deep into the heartland of the US around 600 to 1000 AD, most likely coming up through the Gulf of Mexico and then up the Mississippi River. In fact, just a mile north and a mile south of Heavener lies two more runestones. Supporters of the theory claim it's not as crazy as it sounds, as they cite other runestones that have been found, such as the Kensington Runestone found in Minnesota. Oklahoma itself has the most stones found out of every state in the US, with a total of 6. Local historian Gloria Farley claimed that starting at Newfoundland, a Viking expedition could have easily sailed down the North American eastern seaboard, swung around Florida, into the Gulf of Mexico, and entered the Mississippi, before finally branching off onto the Arkansas River, then the Poteau River in Oklahoma. Many disagree, of course, and that has led to all kinds of speculation. Some think it was made by a person living there during the French colonization period of the 18th century. Some even claim that a member from the 1667 expedition of the famous French explorer René Robert Cavelier as being the one responsible. Although it's not likely to be solved anytime soon, one thing is for certain: it's one of the most intriguing runestones out there. Thousands of people from across the world go there every year just to see it, including some of the most respected scholars in Europe. Goddard Coin. On August 18, 1957, at a prehistoric archaeological site in Brooklyn, Maine, known as the Goddard Site, a local resident and amateur archaeologist, Guy Meldrum, was searching around in what was an old Native American settlement when he came across a peculiar coin. Along with this coin would end up being a treasure trove of artifacts. Nearly 30,000 items of interest would be taken away from the site over a period of years, and just like those other items, there's not really a good record on the coin's actual finding. But what we do know is that it was the second year that Meldrum had been digging through the site, and at first, it was thought to be a 12th century British coin. But by 1978, experts from London started to consider the coin may be of Norse origin, and modern technology would eventually prove them right, as it was determined that the coin was no doubt a silver coin minted between 1065 and 1080 AD during Olaf the Peaceful's reign as King of Norway. The coin was widely circulated in the 12th and 13th centuries. The penny also had a hole in it, indicating that it most likely was used as a pendant. The original coin has since crumbled to dust. The Goddard site itself dates back to 1180 to 1235 AD, which is around the time that the penny was being circulated. The people that lived at the site are generally considered to be the ancestors of the Penobscot tribe. The penny, of course, is a mystery, because it was found much further south than Newfoundland, where we know for sure the Vikings made it to. It was also found about 200 years after their exploration voyages. So how did this coin make it to an abandoned Native American site? There's basically a couple of theories on this one. The first one, and the one that really intrigues historians, is that perhaps the Vikings did sail further south than previously thought, and traded this coin with the local natives. However, a couple of things go against this theory. For one, it's the only Viking item recovered at the site, and it's not likely they would have traveled that far and just traded one coin. Secondly, as some of the other artifacts found are from indigenous cultures, such as the door set from far north, indicating the site was most likely just a hub of a large native trading network, and that the penny made it down from Newfoundland as it circulated through this vast Indian trading system. Another likely theory is that it was a hoax. In fact, it was pretty easy to buy Norwegian silver coins and other coins from the time period on the open market in 1957. It's been proposed that Guy Melgren bought the coin himself, planted it there, and then came back later on to find it. Or someone else bought it and planted the coin, and Melgren was duped. And that's been a debate basically since it was discovered, but the most recent conjecture is that the coin was a legit find. If that is indeed true, it would be the only undisputed Viking artifact discovered in America. Hawaiian-Chumash canoe designs. The Chumash peoples are a Native American tribe located in the central and southern coastal regions of California, extending from Morro Bay in the north to Malibu in the south. They also occupied at least 4 islands off the coast of California, and in occupying those islands, the Chumash had to find a way to get there. So they created an interesting canoe called the Tommel, and this plank canoe is unlike every other canoe used by Native Americans on the coast. For one, it took 6 months of highly skilled labor to do it. Taking logs from redwood, pine, and fir, they would split the planks using whalebone wedges and some stone tools. Then they made a clay-lined pit which would hold water. The planks were then boiled in these pits for several hours to make them pliable, and to bring the water up to a boil, the Chumash simply added red-hot rocks from the fire. They then drilled holes into the planks and sewed them together with waxed milkweed twine, and then added an adhesive made from tar and pine that sealed the boat. Finally, they would sand the boat with shark skin and paint it with red ochre, a clay in the area, and they would often decorate the boat with designs and a shell inlay. It would finally end up being about 25 feet in length, 3 to 4 feet wide, 3 foot deep, and could hold anywhere from 8 to 12 people. The Chumash would then use the canoe to travel up and down the coast and out to the islands in a complex system of trade. There was not another canoe being used on the Pacific coast that could compete with it. It was faster, more stable at sea, more durable, and could carry huge loads. The oldest evidence found of the craft comes from about 1300 years ago. Around the same time, they started making another interesting item, that being an elaborate and curved style fish hook made by lashing 2 pieces of bone together. Before this, they had used the same type of fish hook that looked like a toothpick for about 6,000 years. So doesn't it seem kinda odd that the Chumash invented a canoe and a new style fish hook around the same time in 700 AD? That's where the mystery begins, as it's been used as a launching point to once again show the connection between the Native American tribes and the Polynesian peoples. The Tommel was found only in 3 areas: California, the coast of Chile and South America, and the Polynesian Islands. To be specific, the Polynesians that were colonizing Hawaii about 700 AD, the same time the Chumash first began building Tommels. Interestingly, the word Tommel does not appear to be related, or even close, to other Chumash words. but seems to be related to the Hawaiian word for useful tree. Santa Barbara is about 2,000 miles from Hawaii. Is it feasible that the Polynesians went there and possibly showed them how to make the tobble? If they did, it was most likely a one-off kind of deal. There was no trade or colonization attempt by the Hawaiians. Instead, one of their boats probably needed to land for a quick repair. They stopped in California, where they pulled it ashore, and the Chumash got to study the process and adapted it as their own. And after all that we have viewed so far in this series, it wouldn't surprise me at all if the Polynesians did make contact. However, one argument against it is a lot of the Hawaiian canoes had sails. The Chumash didn't. Poteau Runestone. Back when we discussed the Heavener Runestone, I mentioned that Oklahoma had the most runestones out of any state, with a total of 6. This one was found near Poteau. It is a carved sandstone about 15 inches long and shows little weathering. The inscription has not been fully solved. It's actually a mixture of letters from different alphabets and made at different times. It appears to read Gloiea, and the last 2 characters have never been solved, and that may be because they're largely expected to be added way later as an attempt to be a hoax. Another interesting clue on this stone is 5 of the 8 letters are the same as the ones on the Heavener stone. This has led many to say that the Poteau stone was a copy of the Heavener stone, and then someone came along later and added 3 more. And considering there is very little weathering, the entire thing has mostly been dismissed as a hoax. And since there is hardly any support and defense of this stone, we'll simply move on. Shawnee Runestone. Now we come to the third stone of the so-called Oklahoma runestones, and this one is called the Shawnee Runestone, which was found in August of 1969 by Zheng He, who was taking his 7-year-old brother-in-law and another boy on a snake hunt, when they come across an oval stone that was about 14 inches long in the weeds, buried about an inch into the soil. The stone was a soft red Permian sandstone. They turned it over to look for a snake, and instead found a strange inscription, an inscription that looked rather recent, especially considering the inscription is not as weathered as the rest of the stone. The inscription reads MLDOK or MIDOK. Closer inspection of the stone has since revealed that it could have been created in the 50s or 60s. Regardless, it's been debunked, so we'll move on. Voyages of Henry I Sinclair, Earl of Orkney. Henry Sinclair was a Scottish and Norwegian nobleman who lived between 1345 and the early 1400s AD. It's said that he would acquire the position of the Lord High Admiral in 1358, working directly for the King of Scotland, but it's most likely that he earned that position a few years later. But what he's most famous for, and the reason he's on this iceberg, is because of a legend that says he took part in an exploration of North America 100 years before Columbus. Now the theory on this is a little convoluted, but I'll try to sum it up the best I can while keeping the important details intact. In 1558, a man named Niccolo Zeno the Younger would publish a map and a series of letters that described an exploration made by 2 brothers, the Zeno brothers, way back in 1390. Niccolo, of course, was a descendant of these 2 great men, and Niccolo claimed that he had just randomly found these items in the storeroom of his family home, and if that sounds sketchy to you, that's because it is sketchy. However, for some weird reason, this claim was widely accepted at the time. It was even put on maps by some of the best cartographers in the world. It wasn't until the modern era that historians started to widely dismiss this whole thing as a hoax, and an attempt by the Republic of Venice to make a land claim on the Americas. But in these documents was a weird letter that stated that the 2 brothers had made this voyage under the direction of an explorer/prince named Zheng He. He was supposedly the lord of some islands off the southern coast of Friesland, which may or may not have existed, but it was supposed to be larger than Ireland and located just south of Iceland. Anyways, Zheng He had rescued the 2 brothers after their ship ran aground, and when the 3 began to talk, they would plan to go on this expedition together, out past Greenland and into the west, and they supposedly discovered America. Now, if we jump 200 years into the future, in the late 1700s, a naturalist named Johann Forster, while researching the letters, would come up with a theory that the Prince Zheng He, who led the Zeno brothers across the North Atlantic to the Americas, was actually Henry Sinclair, and I have no idea how he reached that conclusion, but ever since he did, Sinclair has been bandied about by numerous authors that allege he was parading up and down the North American coast in the 1300s. The reasons vary, from simple things like the name Prince Zheng He was a misreading of the word Prince of Orkney, which is a bit of a stretch, to the carvings in Rosslyn Chapel, which was built by Henry's grandson in Scotland, that shows plants that proponents of the theory claim are New World plants such as corn or maize, which was unknown to Europe at the time, and it's used to prove that Henry Sinclair had indeed visited America before Columbus. Yet, skeptics say it's nothing more than depictions of wheat, strawberries, or lilies. Making this one even more confusing is the theory that Sinclair was a Knight Templar, and that the voyage either was sponsored by them or on behalf of them. Even though the order was suppressed almost a half a century before Henry's life, supposedly, the Knights Templar discovered, under the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, a royal archive dating from King Solomon's time. In that archive was the story of the Phoenicians, who voyaged to the west continent following a star called L'America. Now that the Templars learned of this continent, they planned a route based on that star, and Sinclair followed it, supposedly in 1398. To add to this, some stories say him and his Freemason pals escaped with assorted treasures and the Holy Grail, and settled in Nova Scotia with the Micmac Indians. And although this story is kind of crazy, the Micmac tribe do have a traditional story about a king who long ago came over from an island far across the sea with many soldiers, and pretty much fit the same story told by the Zeno brothers. Oh, and that reminds me, it's probably a good time to point out that while Henry was there, he also built the Newport Tower. Sinclair is one of those stories where there was just too much added, and it should have just been left with the Zeno brothers story. With all the Templar stuff added in, it's just hard to take as legit. Almost every historian has claimed it's a hoax. Personally, I tend to agree with William Thompson's assessment in his 2001 book, The New History of Orkney. Quote, "It has been Earl Henry's singular fate to enjoy an ever-expanding posthumous reputation, which has very little to do with anything he achieved in his lifetime." End quote. Zheng He. Zheng He was a Chinese explorer whose confirmed treasure expeditions to Southeast Asia, South Asia, West Asia, and East Africa took place from 1405 to 1433. He is known as the greatest sailor in Chinese history, and according to legend, his ships were so big that they could carry hundreds of sailors on 4 decks that were almost twice as long as any wooden ship ever recorded. The first 3 voyages reached India, and the last 3 made it to the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa, which was quite an achievement. But the reason it's on here is due to one book, and that was 1421, The Year China Discovered the World, written by Gavin Menzies. The story is written informally, as Menzies traveled around the globe, examining his 1421 hypothesis. According to Menzies, on some of the earliest European world maps, there were lands charted that supposedly the Europeans had never been to, like parts of Africa and Asia. So how did they know to chart it? He postulated that only China at that time had the money and manpower to do these expeditions, and the results they published eventually reached Europe. Okay, I will say that one is not too far out there, but it gets crazier. Menzies continued that they also explored Australia, New Zealand, the Americas, Antarctica, the Northeastern Passage, circumnavigated Greenland, and attempted to reach the poles. However, Menzies doesn't actually have anything in the way of evidence for this, and that's because he claims all of the New World discoveries were lost by the Ming imperial court, or burned, because they feared the cost of further voyages would bankrupt the economy. Not surprisingly, this story has been almost universally rejected by historians, even Chinese historians. Some have even called Menzies a charlatan, and considering he wrote a book just a few years later, called 1434, The Year a Magnificent Chinese Fleet Sailed to Italy and Ignited the Renaissance, well, it's hard to argue with those dismissive claims. In addition, The Zheng He expeditions, while impressive, were just using well-established old Chinese trading routes, so it wasn't anything especially groundbreaking. And since Menzies' main argument for the Chinese discovering the Americas comes down to, why not? I will just skip to the next one. Ageratum conyzoides in Hawaii before Cook. This plant, which is more commonly known by the name billy goat weed, is an invasive weed that is native to tropical South America, particularly Brazil. It stands about 1 to 3 feet tall, and the flowers have a white to lilac color. When the plant has grown outside its natural range, it becomes rampant, and it has been found in other parts of the world, and at least in 12 US states. And that's probably not crazy, considering the way international travel is these days. But here's the mystery. When Captain James Cook was the first European to step foot in Hawaii in 1778, supposedly it was discovered that billy goat weed was running rampant in the area. This is another Polynesian/South American connection, but I just can't find much info on this one, so I'll move on. Skálholt Map. Skálholt is a historical site in southern Iceland, located at the river Vita. For 8 centuries, it was one of the most important places in Iceland. It actually housed Iceland's first official school, which was founded in 1045 to educate clergy. And throughout the Middle Ages, it was actually a pretty active area. There was extensive farming, a smithy, and a monastery. It was called the largest city in Iceland, and in the late 16th century, a young teacher named Sigurd Stefánsson from Skálholt would start to go through all of the available data on all the ancient Norse discoveries. He would then use this info to create a map, and on this map, he documented the Viking voyages into the Atlantic, even marking Vinland's location. However, by 1570, the original map had disappeared. Luckily, in 1690, a copy was made by Thorlacius, the Bishop of Skálholt, and it's not really clear if he made a copy on the data that was still available, or if he made a copy from a copy of the one that was lost in the 1500s. I'm not really sure. Anyways, after this version was made, numerous other copies would be made, and it was shown that the northern tip of Vinland was at the same latitude as the southern tip of Ireland. So when they moved that over to a modern map, they realized that the area labeled Promontorium Winlandia, which was Vinland, lined up pretty well with the northeastern tip of Newfoundland, which led directly to the discovery of Alonso Meadows in 1960. Pre-Columbian Eurasian metal across the Bering Strait. So this one I have actually already covered on my Most Obscure Conspiracy Theories Iceberg Part 3. It basically touches on the trade that most likely was going on between the peoples of Siberia and the peoples of Alaska before Europeans were even aware of the continent. You can find a link to that video in the upper right hand corner if you want to check it out. And I reckon that's enough for this video. I wanted to get away from the unsolved death and tragedy mega iceberg for a bit, so I thought I would make another one of these. If you guys like this video, let me know in the comment section below, and I will make a part 3 soon. I hope you enjoyed.